Hello, hello, hello. Let's get into something. Let's get all the way into it. Now, unless you've been under a rock, you know that 2004 school shooter Jon Romano has turned himself into a white supremacy pipeline. Now, he can't really profit off of his crime, but he can profit off of pushing forward the idiotic ideology of reverse racism and utilizing the two-tier justice system against a mentally ill black man while utilizing his white privilege to get sympathy and have people advocate for his forgiveness while monetizing everything he possibly can. Now, he's put out a narrative, and it's really looking like he has a PR team that's working hard to flood search engines with only his perspective. Now, there is another video here on this platform that showcases his manifesto and all of that. And on Fridays, Conversations with Taz podcast, and Thursdays, there's information regarding him suing to keep a documentary regarding his school shooting from being distributed out to the public. But there's something else that I want to sit here and get into it with you. Okay? Because for everybody that has so many excuses for him, I sure would love this to be explained.
The TikToker just turned off his comments after people from all over the world began coming after him and his followers by the boatload. For those of you who don't know, this guy's name is Jon Romano. He shot up a school back in 2004. Here's what went down. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Jon had been begging his mom to buy him a shotgun, and after much persistence, she did. Then one night, the then 16-year-old wrote up a manifesto explaining he'd been fantasizing about blasting up his school for the past few years. That he was tired of being ignored, tired of not being seen, and that he was tired of being lied to by certain individuals. The next morning, he woke up, placed that firearm in a large black carrying case, then drove himself to school where he entered a second-floor bathroom. It was there Jon spent the next 20 minutes preparing himself for what he was about to do. But then, just as he began to walk.
Now, if you've ever ventured onto his TikTok page, and by the way, he's been banned from Reddit for trying to push out the videos in his narrative regarding his sword attack. But on his TikTok account, well, I believe he has two, he keeps saying that he basically wanted suicide by cop. He didn't need to go into the school for that. But let's keep going.
Walk out, another student walked in. That student fled back to class where he barricaded the room and informed his teacher of the situation. Jon then fired 2 rounds just above the head of 2 students entering the hallway. It's worth noting the spread came so close it quite literally knocked the hat off of one of those students. Jon then started making his way down the hall.
Jon was a bad shot. Jon wanted a shotgun, but Jon, we'll chalk it up to being young and dumb, didn't even practice with said shotgun. He was a bad shot. If he was not such a bad shot, the trauma would have been increased for those involved.
16-year-old wrote up a manifesto explaining he'd been fantasizing about blasting up his school for the past few years. That he was tired of being ignored, tired of not being seen, and that he was tired of being lied to by certain individuals.
Now, as I referenced, there is another video that has more details about Jon, but I must note that there was a period of time that the school did not want him on the premises. There are also at least 2 people who, before this incident at the school, reported, and there was proof corroborated by a nurse, that he had choked 2 people. He had received psychiatric care. But yeah, his intent was clear.
Morning, he woke up, placed that firearm in a large black carrying case, then drove himself to school where he entered a second floor bathroom. It was there Jon spent the next 20 minutes preparing himself.
And I want you to know that school officials said that there were no metal detectors like in urban schools. So I want you to keep all of this in mind regarding his mindset leading up to the pipeline that he's publicly become now.
For what he was about to do. But then, just as he began to walk out, another student walked in. That student fled back to class where he barricaded the room and informed his teacher of the situation. Jon then fired 2 rounds just
Before Jon fired the rounds, people who he perceived to be his friends, he had texted and told them that he had a firearm and for them to leave. There were a series of students who were texting one another, hey, somebody has a gun, somebody has a gun, somebody has a gun.
above the head of 2 students entering the hallway. It's worth noting the spread came so close it quite literally knocked the hat off of one of those students. Jon then started making his way down the hallway, where he entered a classroom and just stared down several students prior to walking back out. He then fired 1 more round into the side of a door just before the vice principal grabbed him from behind. And as they struggled for control of the firearm, Jon fired 1 more round, striking another faculty member directly in the shin.
Does that sound like someone who just wanted it all to end, that they were in such pain that they wanted to be taken out by the cops? The cops, by the way, that when they came in, they were shuffled off to a middle school that was in close proximity, and children were being bused to and from there. Because if the whole goal was for him to end himself, because he even left a note to his sister that's in the other video. You're caught. You could have turned it on yourself. But let's keep going.
Well, Jon was charged with attempted murder and would spend the next 17 years behind bars for his action. He was then released in 2020. But here's the thing. Just 2 years later, in January of 2022, he started posting on TikTok. However, it wasn't until December of that same year, people began to realize just who he was and what he had done. Now hear me out, because I promise you I'm gonna make this make sense. Rewind back just 3 months to September of 2022. Jon is working at what is essentially a soup kitchen when a guy comes in and starts
January 2022, he begins posting online. Then he starts working at a soup kitchen. Reports say, because he's still the only one calling the attack a hate crime and that it was racially based. I hate to keep referring to the other video, but it's very important that you watch that also. Even when someone, the head of the soup kitchen, was interviewed, no race, no slurs, no nothing was brought up. I need you to keep in mind, he was setting himself up to become a victim in some way, in some capacity. Because there are also reports that when this man that you see right now on the screen had weapons in his hand, a sword and a machete, Jon kept antagonizing him. He wanted to become a victim. He did several interviews with the news saying he wanted it to be a hate crime. He wanted this man to feel the full arm of the 2-tier justice system while he himself never felt it. He needed to become a victim. He knew that he could not hide what he did forever, especially given the nature of TikTok. People want to know who you are, and creators slip up all the time. And he knows that if he slips up and says the wrong thing, and he knows ultimately what he wanted his message to be, that people would pull up this you and it would be out there. But in all of his interviews and all of his TikTok videos, he says nothing about the fact that after the Parkland shooting, he wrote a letter to a newspaper in his hometown. He wants fame. He doesn't want redemption. And he wants to finally be able to openly let his biases fly. Keep watching.
Starts acting erratic, and Jon tells him, look, you gotta go. Just a few minutes later, that same guy came back wielding 2 swords and just started going to town on Jon. I mean, this was an extremely violent attack, and Jon almost ended up losing both of his arms and legs due to it. Well, over the months that followed, Jon...
And also, this is an interfaith soup kitchen. Jon was not the only white person working there. He was not the only white person in the building. That gentleman walked past multiple white people to get to Jon. If it was just a race thing, why walk past so many white people? And if Jon is so innocent and so redeemed, why is he working overtime to use every inkling of his privilege to stifle every other voice? There were multiple people that day who witnessed the attack. There were multiple students that were affected and multiple faculty members that were affected. But nobody hears from them. Let's continue.
Jon began cultivating a rather large following of people solely off of this horrifying event. Now, at first, people being directed...
It was not solely off of that event. It was him saying, woe is me, I'm now a member of this disabled community and I can no longer work, but I'm such a good Samaritan. Go to my Amazon wish list that you have no idea where anything is being shipped and buy all these things or donate to me. And by the way, I believe reverse racism exists and this is why I was attacked. He firmly utilized the same bullshit narrative that has existed since Black labor was no longer free.
Towards his TikTok by news outlets, we're seeing headlines such as guy working at soup kitchen attacked with swords. And by the end of that same month, those headlines changed from this to this, talking about how a school shooter from back in '04 was attacked by a maniac with 2 swords.
And the wording is key here. Yes, they do finally reveal that Jon was a school shooter. But once again, they only give his perspective. There's no fact checking. None of his statements have been fact checked for corroboration. There's no quotes from anyone else. It's like, yeah, he was a school shooter, but now he's the victim of racism. We know who eats that up.
Only then did Jon actually post a video explaining what he had done, and surprisingly, people were extremely supportive of his objective.
Why surprisingly? Look how he set it up. Look how he set it up. This is from the playbook. If you didn't catch it before, you should have caught it through Womblands season 1 through Infinity. The lighting, the red nose, the looking like you've been crying for hours, the sad, infantilized look, the trying to make yourself small.
Stated he had been forgiven, that he had served his time, and that he had paid his dues to our society. But all...
Interesting. George Floyd died. But because he previously had an addiction that he had not yet overcome, he should be vilified for all eternity, and he died at the hands of someone else. But the great white hope here should just be forgiven because he served his time. Okay.
All that would change when Jon posted the following video.
I was in middle school when Columbine happened, and I remember being terrified afterwards, actually. I don't remember the day it happened. I never watched the news.
He remembers exactly what they had on, because I give you 2 guesses as to what Jon was wearing the day that he decided to become an infamous school shooter. And this is also something you need to keep in mind. He's sitting here saying that he's working with all these authorities. He has not named a single organization that he's working with regarding school shootings. He was at a soup kitchen. But it's about infamy. It's about going down in infamy. Let us not forget there's an entire book called Blood Letters and Bad Men. There are websites and organizations dedicated to giving the most heinous criminals pen pals. There are people clamoring still for the mold of Ted Bundy. There are people who pay the dentist who took the mold for him to take and pierce their skin or press down on their skin. It's about infamy. He just wasn't expecting to survive. He was bad. He set a goal. He was bad at his goal.
Moves or anything, but I remember the atmosphere kind of changing in the school where suddenly everybody realized like somebody could come in and start shooting.
It was at this point, parents who had lost children in these types of situations began stitching his videos.
You'll never receive my respect. And even though that I wasn't even involved with the school shooting that you initiated and did, you will never get my forgiveness for it. And I don't feel sorry for anything that you have faced since then. You deserve it.
I leave you with this clip taken from an Aunt Karen Live, where Jon joined to say his piece.
Why are you talking about me? Why do you got my picture showing on there? You're
Because
trying to
I
get
don't
views
think you
and
belong.
likes off of me.
Did you hear that? You're trying to get views and likes off of me. He knows why people are talking about him. He's had news outlet after news outlet after news outlet recently reaching out to him. He knows about the buzz he created around himself. He chose to go on to Aunt Karen's live. He knows that he's been the topic of conversation from the thousands of stitches, duets, think pieces. But now we want to, he's always playing a victim when he's around Black people. But let's continue.
And my tragedy that I committed.
My tragedy that I committed. How is it his tragedy? It's a tragedy that he created for other people. But you hear his words, my tragedy. How narcissistic of you, Jon.
So you are disrespecting not only me for
She's disrespecting him for what he went through.
what I went through. You're disrespecting my victims because
Disrespecting him for what he went through and disrespecting his victims, but he's the one putting himself in a position that his victims cannot escape him. He's leaving out the disrespect he had towards his victims when he stifled their voices. And the faculty member that he shot in the shin has been fighting for him to be charged with shooting him.
you're not interested in bettering things. You're on here bullshitting with people. So
Jon seeking peace is telling someone he does not want to be held accountable. He does not want growth. He does not want criticism. He just made everything about himself. Once again, he's making himself the victim and he needs to be saved. And one thing for certain, two things for sure. We know that the default damsels in distress in society will always infantilize a white man. White men never have to grow up. There's always somebody out there to protect them from accountability.
You care
have a
about
good
the
night.
you care about the victims of I'm somehow hurting the victims of your school shooting while you're sitting on this app trying to garner sympathy because you were attacked by swords and I'm the problem?
What do y'all think?
A lot of you need to think long and hard why you are so quick to have a bleeding heart for certain people, why you are so quick to excuse people's behavior, and why are you so quick to allow them to antagonize, and terrorize repeatedly people for you to turn around and try to convince the whole world that they are a victim. Now, do I believe that Aunt Karen should have had him on? Absolutely not, given his history. Absolutely not, because he's going to keep seeking out Black people to be compatible with, because that's his narrative now. The narrative doesn't sound familiar to you? White men are now the most oppressed class of people in the United States. We're now receiving so much racism against the white man. How, when there's been no change of systems? But he's going to keep pushing that narrative. He's going to keep pushing that narrative to the point where you forget his egregiousness. You forget that when he watched back the news coverage of the school shooting that he perpetuated, he laughed. He cackled in the jail cell. And even while being prosecuted, people wanted sympathy on him. And it's only because he survived. Because we know what the narrative is when they don't survive. It's always, oh, I didn't know. I just didn't know. But pray for the families. Stop platforming the most egregious within society. This is why we keep having more and more of an occurrence of them. He is what Kyle Rittenhouse wanted to be. Able to live out his murderous fantasy and then monetarily capitalize on it and become popular and a face of the alt-right. Kyle was too young and too immature to do it. Jon had to grow up extremely quickly behind those prison gates. And he had time to sit back and think and plan. And when Parkland came around and he knew he had a niche. He just needed to find a way to become a victim to a point that people were willing to forgive what he did before. Because the most heinous of the heinous is always forgiven when something catastrophic happens to them. Just be mindful of it and stop looking at things just at the surface level. Always get into it.